On December 20th, 1860, a convention of South Carolinians unanimously voted to leave the Union. We visited that earlier, I believe, in the Time Life book. 6 other states followed in the next 6 weeks. Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, and Texas. It was the worst crisis the nation had ever faced. However, 8 slave states, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, Arkansas, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware, remained loyal to the Union. This suggested that many Southerners did not wish to secede, an impression reinforced by the fact that in most of the states that did leave the Union, a substantial minority had voted against secession. For these and other reasons, when the Lincoln administration took office in March, it hoped that some means might be found to undermine the secessionist movement without bloodshed. He didn't even get into office yet, and they had seceded. So he comes on the scene. What's he going to do? Is he going to let him secede or not? A lot of people down there had voted against secession. Perhaps, as Secretary of State William Seward believed, most Southerners would eventually repudiate disunion if given time to reconsider. In the meantime, however, delegates from the seceded states formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America. Meeting in Montgomery, Alabama, they drafted a new constitution and established a provisional government to be led by Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War. One of the new government's first acts was to assume authority over the artillery batteries erected by Southern Carolina to threaten the tiny federal garrison of Fort Sumter. It's one of their very first actions. What should we do violently? The Confederate government insisted that the Lincoln administration withdraw the garrison. Its claim to sovereignty over the ceded South would be meaningless if a foreign power continued to occupy one of the Confederacy's principal ports. So at this point it's starting to get hot. It's like we're not just talking. We want Northern soldiers out of what we now call the South. The symbolism of Fort Sumter was equally important to Lincoln, since to order its evacuation would be a fatal display of weakness. For weeks the standoff persisted. Finally, President Davis gave orders that if the fort refused to surrender, it must be bombarded. The firing on Fort Sumter on April 12th ended any chance that the sectional rift could be repaired without bloodshed. Undermanned, low on food, cut off from resupply, Fort Sumter surrendered on April 14th. The following day, Lincoln requested 75,000 3-month volunteers to suppress the rebellion. Seems like he was kind of moved by circumstances. He didn't request them the day before, you know? I mean, he didn't request them a week before or anything like that. He wasn't planning a massive invasion of bloodshed. Perhaps if he would have planned it, perhaps if when he got into office he would have immediately said, we need 2 million man army now. Maybe that would have been the best thing to do, huh? We're going to skip down a bit in a section called Military Resources and Objectives. The Confederacy's aim at the beginning of the war was simple: hold on to the de facto independence already obtained. It did not need to invade the North or dictate a peace treaty on the steps of the White House. All it had to do was continue the struggle long enough for the North to tire of the war and accept the fact of secession. So this is just like Vietnam or Korea. All we have to do is fight and fight and fight with the Americans long enough until they get tired and leave. That's all we have to do. We don't have to invade America to win this war. We just have to get them to leave and leave us alone. In many respects, so it's just like Vietnam, but we won. In many respects, this aim was little different from that of the American colonies during the Revolution, except that our land is contiguous and Britain was not contiguous. That earlier conflict had been won largely by attrition. The British had captured the colony's cities almost at will, traversed American territory as they pleased, and dominated the seas that bathed American shores, but they could neither quench the Americans' will to fight, nor prevent foreign intervention once the Americans had shown their capacity for sustained resistance. Now there was a Pyrrhian victory by the British, Long Island, I think, in New York, and the commander said, if we have 1 or 2 more such victories, we will have lost the war. A Pyrrhian victory goes back to the Greek city of Piraeus, which is just down a bit from Athens on the shoreline, and I think King Darius won a battle there, and was so wiped out after he won the battle he had to leave. Or was it Sparta? Sparta won the Pyrrhian victory, and then they won, and they were just destroyed and had to leave. A Pyrrhian victory. You win, but you've destroyed yourself in the victory. Conceivably, the Confederates might have adopted a similar strategy, pin their forces to the defense of no fixed area or city, draw the invaders in, and wear out the Federals by a protracted war of attrition. Instead, Davis and his advisors decided to fight the battle at the frontier. Now, you might at first say, well, why didn't he do that? Why didn't they just allow the North to invade and then, pick them off and fight them tooth and nail, like guerrilla war? But Davis and his advisors decided to fight the battle at the frontier. They would repulse incursions and attempt to hold major concentrations of population and resources. A number of considerations made this obvious strategy. First, the discrepancy in military strength between the North and the South, although hardly an even match, was far less forbidding than that between Britain and the American colonies. So they thought they had a better chance than America had against Britain. Second, the political pressures within the Confederacy for a conventional defense were also great. Every locality clamored for Southern troops to protect it. Right? So this is a republic. This isn't just a dictatorship. So their troops have to be answerable to the population. And every single population was like, we want troops here to protect us from the North. Third, a conventional defense would give the Confederacy greater legitimacy in the eyes of its own citizens and in those of the world. And finally, the delicate, peculiar institution needed the stability of law and order to survive. The mere presence of hostile political party in the White House had threatened the stability enough to spur the Cotton States to secession. So what would happen if there were foreign troops? The slaves would rebel. Given the enormous sensitivity of this issue, the Confederacy could hardly permit federal armies to plunge deep into Southern territory. Even if formal federal policy remained one of non-interference with slave labor, an advancing Union army would surely disrupt slave labor, create a flood of runaways, perhaps even raise the specter of a race war of slave against master. The Confederacy then had many good reasons to defend itself at the border. We skip down a ways. Confederates worried comparatively little about the larger size and greater resource base of their opponent, partly from overconfidence, but primarily because of a conviction that the war would be brief and comparatively limited, a contest on the scale of, say, the recent Mexican War. That was about 13 years earlier. But in a longer struggle, the North's advantage were substantial. With a population of 20 million, the northern states obviously possessed a much larger military manpower base, but their industrial capacity was far greater as well. We already know about that. Massive disparity. 75% of the nation's total wealth was in the North. So skip down a bit here. The North's advantages did not end there. It controlled the resources of a long-established government, including the 16,000 men of the Army and 90 warships of the Navy, so it had all the infrastructure from the old government. Now it seems to me that the Southerners who went forward against these odds and in defense of this horrible institution deserve the blame. That's what it seems to me. Any actions on the North to end this institution were by all means right, although not obligatory. But the Southerners are the ones who deserve blame. Excuse me. The Southerners are the ones who said, I am going to die before I'll let you take my slaves away. That's not admirable. We can't allow this as a defensible position. So it seems like the Southerners who said we're going to secede and I don't care if 97% of the arms manufacturers in the North, we're going to win. Yeah, I mean, that's irresponsible to take your nation into a slaughter like that in defense of such a despicable institution. Even so, most of the North's advantages were potential rather than real. It would take time for the Union to translate its demographic and economic resources into effective strength. And in the interim, the Confederacy would create military forces of impressive size. To be sure, the Federals usually held the edge in manpower and heavy weaponry, but only at the margins.